This is a red maple, but it's not a normal red maple. Usually there's a single stem, but if we look at this one, we see that there's actually 7 separate stems coming out of the base. That doesn't normally happen. What happens is if someone cuts down a red maple, this stump usually doesn't die and it will send out water sprouts. In this case, 7 of them survived to become full-grown major stems. This is one of the larger examples of the wild grape that we have fairly commonly around here. As you can see, it's really a massive vine. These fortunately don't tend to hurt the trees very much. They grow right up into the trees and get their support from the trees. Other vines tend to strangle the trees, but this one more or less gets along okay with the trees and just uses them for support. If you look closely at this particular vine, you'd get the impression that it's dead. For instance, there you can see right through it to the tree behind it. And that's because a lot of the inside of the vine has died. But that's not important to the vine because the vine doesn't need any of that for support. The life of the vine is all in the outer part of the vine, the bark, and right under it a layer that is really efficient at carrying water up into the very tops of the trees. When one of these vines get cut in the spring, it flows water almost like a tap is partially on. And once that water starts to subside, it forms sort of a gel that tends to seal the wound. A lot of times it will actually recover, but more often than not it will start a fresh sprout further down the vine. This is another example of a red maple tree that was cut and a bunch of water sprouts grew back from the base. In this particular instance, if you follow up, it turns out that there were 6 of the water sprouts that survived. What's a little bit odd about this particular one is that you see down here at the base, that was 2 separate water sprouts coming up, and there they are as 2 completely separate stems. But then they merge together, and from that point on up, they grow as a single stem. While this joining of stems is a little bit rare, I've seen it happen several times before, but definitely not a common thing. And there you can see right between them, so that you know that it's actually a completely separate set of limbs at that point. 15 years ago, this sugar maple tree was alive, and it had this huge burl in it, and it was a good healthy burl. I wish at the time I had known someone who made bowls out of burl, because this would have been a beautiful piece. Unfortunately I didn't, and I let the tree die, and unfortunately it just started to rot away. So one good burl sample just disappeared. You can see the woodpeckers have used this as a regular feeding place. The round holes are made by most of your average woodpeckers, but then you come down and you see this that's more like a square hole. Those are made by pileated woodpeckers. For reasons that I don't understand, they tend to like to make holes that are rectangular or sometimes even square, like this one. Here you can see 2 a little bit further down that are definitely made by pileated woodpeckers. They're a large bird, not that much smaller than the ivory-billed was, but they're still pretty abundant. Here you see some of the typical mixed hardwood and pine forests that we tend to have around here. A lot of these, if you look up top, are actually pine trees. You notice also there's a good bit of light coming in because it's winter. But as we swing around down to the stream valley here, it gets a lot darker. And that's because what we've got a lot of here are hemlock trees. The hemlocks tend to like the cool, wet valleys, and they keep fairly dense shade throughout the year. If we swing even further around, we start to see all over the ground the wild grape. That's all of those contorted vines that are growing in different places. "30 years ago, a few years before we bought this property, the owner had it logged. And in the process of logging it, a lot of the trees that were being dragged to the loading area rubbed against the bases of the adjoining trees and did damage to them. This is the result of that. Quite a few along each of the trails have been damaged at the base. Some of them have died, and some of them are in the process of dying." Here's the trail, and if we follow back towards us, here's a basswood that also had the bottom damaged. Now, I'm not going to blame the loggers, because really you can't get trees out of the forest without dragging at least the trunks, but it's a pity to see so much collateral damage. Just another example of, in this case, a pine tree that was damaged by having the logging operation drag against its base. This is the typical forest floor we see. It's generally tan with all the dead oak leaves and other things. But if we swing over this way, we get into an area of much lighter leaves. These are beech leaves. The beech trees tend to hang on to their leaves right through the winter. And if we look around, we see an example there. And actually, if you look closely, they're all over the place, tucked back in the woods. Their saplings are much more prevalent than the adult trees. And they're kind of interesting late in the season. It's end of February now, and they're the only trees that still have their leaves on. Oaks tend to have them on a fairly long time, but the beech will keep them right through until the spring, and then they'll drop them and have new leaves grow. What's really curious to me is that the only beech trees that keep them are the young trees. The mature trees do not keep them. So what we see over here with all these dropped are probably from intermediate age birch trees, beech trees that have dropped their leaves rather than keeping them all the way through the winter. While everyone's familiar with evergreen trees, not necessarily everyone knows that ferns tend to stay green year-round. Even under the snow, they'll be this bright, vibrant green, and they won't lose that. I think it's great. On the partially shaded side of this young sugar maple, we can see where the beaver's chisel-like teeth have made numerous cuts to fell it. And there on the ground are some of the chips that are left over from that operation. The main part of the water that they're living in is over here. And if we swing around and look over in this area, we see some of the stems that they've cut off. And the thing that I find interesting about it is that the further they get from the water, the more likely it is that all the cutting took place on the water side. And I think that's because they're nervous about predators and they want to be able to retreat as quickly as possible to the water. Not always the case, but it does definitely seem to be a trend. This is one of the things I always like to see, sort of a rebirth. Underneath here, that is the stump of a large pine tree that was logged out almost 30 years ago. And growing on top of it is a sweet birch. At some point, one of the tiny little sweet birch seeds fell into the moss that was forming on top of the trunk, and it was a moist enough and nutritious enough environment that it was able to grow in it, and now it's sending roots all the way down to the ground. And you can see here we've actually got a hole right through where the stump was. So the stump is eventually going to completely decompose, and this sweet birch will be kind of on its own with these weird branches or weird roots having to support it up in the air. But just nice to see this life coming from death. This is one of the tiny little seeds from the sweet birch tree. The birch seeds tend to form in what looks somewhat like little tiny pine cones, but they're slightly different. The shape is sort of this bird's foot shape where there's a heel and two toes and a center toe. And it's just kind of surprising to see the variety of sizes there are in tree seeds. We're used to thinking of acorns and peach pits and walnuts. Even apple seeds are fairly substantial, but you can get into some really small ones like this. I wish I could show you just one. There's about 8 on this particular leaf, and what I'm referring to is what some people call the snow fleas, and there are literally millions of them hopping around now. They're just really tiny. If there were the normal snow on the ground, they would actually be on top of the snow, but right now you can hear them hopping from, there went one. This is the typical forest floor we have. Mostly leaves, some pine needles, but not a lot of small stuff growing because there's a lot of competition for light, and so not much gets through to the ground. Some species really don't tolerate low light conditions very well. One of those species that doesn't tolerate very well is pine, which makes this thicket of pine seedlings here really bizarre. I've tried to figure out why that's there, because it's the only place on our property where it is. There didn't seem to be any big hole in the sky where light was getting through, but for some reason very dense, hundreds and hundreds of little pine seedlings right in this area.